about probably one of the greatest divides between the science and practice of IO psychology with decision making. So, specifically, industrial organizational psychology and the tools that we bring, and those tools, in my opinion, are science based, empirical research based knowledge of human behavior and the measurement of individual differences. So those are two big areas, but honestly, that also breaks down into the O side and the I side. So the understanding of human behavior is usually what is actually fueling the practice of organizational psychology. How do we make better teams? How do we make more enjoyable workplaces? How do we make sure people are motivated? And do we need to motivate them? Do we need to actively motivate them, or do we need to create a situation that motivates them? So job satisfaction, organizational commitment, all of those are based on our understanding of human behavior, and most of it being drawn from actual social cognition, so social psychology and cognitive psychology. The I side is more about how do we actually quantify human differences, and basically then how do we make comparisons, and that is used for selection purposes, that is obviously used for performance appraisal and performance measurement, but then also promotion. Now, for the most part, industrial organizational psychology and its impact as far as organizational psychology, so that human behavior aspect, is well recognized in the workplace. And industrial organizational psychology on the I side's ability to quantify and basically measure individual differences and to also measure performance outcome is well recognized. However, there's a bit of a disconnect in actually using all that information to specifically make empirically, scientifically backed decisions. And this isn't unique to IO psychology. There are a lot of problems at a societal level and at individual and organizational levels that we know the solutions to. We actually know what works. But what works is not necessarily palpable or acceptable to the average person. In other words, they'd rather be happy and wrong than disconnected and right. This was one of the problems that B.F. Skinner, one of basically the founder, in my opinion, of modern behavioralism, ran into, is that his research and his understanding of human behavior was probably closer to being able to actually really predict what someone would do in any one given situation than any other research in psychology. But it also started to seriously question whether or not we are making individual choices or whether we're simply a cluster of, again, very advanced stimuli and response. People didn't like the idea that we are just responding to a long series of complicated stimuli and response. We like the idea of free will. We like the idea of consciousness. We like the idea that we can affect the world in a meaningful way and that it's an individual decision. Now that changes a little bit culturally, but that's pretty close to being a universal trait that we find in some level in all people. So when we come forward to decision making in organizations, we start to get to, like I said, that first big gap where we're now challenging an individual. And the individual we're challenging is often the person that's hired us. And we're basically telling them to get their dirty little hands out of the process. They're rarely going to do this. So I'm going to talk about what science and empirical research has said we should do as far as decision making in selection and in fact decision making throughout organizations. But I don't want to turn you into zealots, because I am telling you that this is a message that many people will not accept or swallow in its unvarnished form. This is one of those areas where our goal is to at least move the bar closer to where it should be than necessarily expecting to make a touchdown. So let's talk about decision making. So the classic decision making study is in itself empirical research. We conduct a rigorous job analysis. And the primary purpose for that job analysis is that we're wanting to actually figure out the predictors and the criterion. So what does the job do, and how do you quantify success at the job? And we're going to use that to be able to determine criteria. What does a successful employee look like? And then we're going to ask, what individual differences can we measure through various techniques to predict success at that criterion? And this may be an iterative process. It may be more than one study to do as we get closer and closer and better refined. And we're going to continue repeating the process until validation has been established. And what that basically represents is the idea that we may initially determine 3 criterion from a job analysis, come up with 3 what we think are fairly good predictors, and we start using them for selection. And we start to track our success at selection. We start to ask, now that we have people in the job, are we actually predicting success? And there's a couple of outcomes that may not actually indicate success. One of them, our predictors are not as strongly related to the criterions as we thought they were. We deem different predictors or more predictors. Or it could also be that the criterion themselves are inaccurate, that once people get on the job, our job analysis actually was not a very good representation of what they do, or what we assumed was the criterion they'd be measured on is not what they're actually being measured on, which means we may need to change the predictors to match those new criterion. So there's always going to be some fine tuning in this process if done correctly. Now again, practice versus science. The science says you do this until you have a highly predictive model that you can trust. The reality may be you only get to do this once. You may not be able to do an iterative process. And that's one of the reasons why that rigorous job analysis really needs to be pushed for, because the better the job analysis, the closer your first dart throw in this process is going to be. If you have a solid, trustable job analysis, you're probably going to at least get close to the original criteria. And because you have a good idea of the original criteria, you have probably a better chance to pick good predictors of those criteria, which means that your first go will at least be probably better than just flipping a coin. You're going to have at least a selection tool that is adding value to the process. Now, ideally, you would continue doing this until you have a highly validated, highly successful, rarely makes an error model. But that in reality is not going to necessarily be the case, and a lot of times there's just not going to be the time, resources, or even will within the organization to do this. This is another one of those examples where the ball may be starting at 0. You would like to get it to 100, but even if you get it to 10, you've made the world a better place. So the most common statistic used in classic validation, and again, this is creating the models that we want to make decisions on, is multiple regression. Simple regression and simple statistical techniques simply just can't consider all the relevant variables. It is very rare we're going to find a job with only one potential criterion that you would ever want to look at and only one potential predictor. And that's really the only thing you could really look at with anything simpler than multiple regression. But a lot of people just plug all the variables into multiple regression. Remember that you also are being trained as at least, I would call you journeyman or journey people, I guess, today. And that is simply an old English term meaning someone with some skill, but not necessarily a master or someone that you would necessarily apprentice with. So this is the old system. Apprentices are learning, journeymen know how to do it, and masters are able to take on apprenticeships. We're trying to get you to that level of being a competent user of statistics with your advanced statistics classes that you're taking, and also our discussion of statistics in these other classes, which means hopefully you will have the knowledge to be able to look for these suppressor variables. That is one of the biggest problems we find in a lot of multiple regression models when they're not being done by someone that actually knows what they're doing in statistics. They just know how to plug in predictors and criterion. Because you can end up with situations where your model actually is not as good as you think it is because you have suppressor variables. We also have to recognize that multiple regression doesn't weight anything. And what I mean by weight is that each variable is simply being put in at the value of how much it predicts the outcome, which means that a multiple regression model may allow strong variables to offset weak variables. So much so, for instance, that you may have in your model actual knowledge of how to do the job, the practical skill necessary. And it's related moderately to the outcome. You need to know how to do the job, and that's what you find in your regression model. And remember, regression models are usually going to be done on people that already have the job, which means they've already proven they know how to do the job. You may also find, however, that a personality variable is a stronger predictor of doing the job well. In other words, beyond that basic skill set, once you have that, what you really need is, for example, extroversion if the job requires a lot of interpersonal interactions. Now you use that multiple regression model to do prediction in new employees. You have someone that absolutely doesn't know how to do the job. They've got a 0, but they've got a great extroverted personality. they may actually be shown by the multiple regression to be predicted to do better at the job than someone that's an introvert that knows how to do the job. So you hire that person and you find out they fail miserably because they can't actually do the work. They simply are a good personal fit for the working environment. So we also have to be cautious that when we're putting in variables, we may have to do some adjustments to how we do multiple regression to make sure that we are not allowing this to happen. It does assume a linear model, linear algebra, are appropriate for job success predictions. And remember, there are some variables, especially in selection, where we're probably wanting a moderate response on a predictor. In other words, if you don't have any score, or you're very low in that predictor, you're not going to do well at the job. What we want is a moderate score. And actually, if you are very high in the score, you may also not do well at the job. I think this could be best given as an example of, I actually worked for a little while as a psychometrician specifically. And at the time when I was hired, they were hiring for a master's level. And that's probably what they should have done. But they assumed a linear model. Well, if a master's student can do this well, or a person with a master's degree, wouldn't someone with a PhD do it even better? Well, honestly, and I don't mean to sound arrogant, the job was beneath me. It was fairly boring. It wasn't testing my skills. It was using very basic statistics because the job was designed for someone at a journeyman level, again, if I pardon my use of Old English. At that point, I was not very happy with the job. Now, could I do it? Absolutely. And could I do it better than probably other people with lesser education? Absolutely. But was I a good fit? No. And that's a nonlinear relationship. If I didn't have the skills, I couldn't do the job. If I had a moderate level of skills, not only could I do the job, it would be challenging. However, it wasn't linear. Having a mastery of the skills made the job somewhat boring. We also have to recognize that we need a fairly large effect size for multiple regression. Optimal when applied to new samples. So basically, we also remember, we talked about this a little bit, the idea of validity shrinkage. That when we actually use a model that we built on a new sample and then move it to a secondary sample or a third sample, in other words, another iterations of selection, we usually find that it doesn't work quite as good as it did on that first sample because by its very nature, multiple regression looks for the absolute best model for our particular set of data. So it works best when it's applied to a brand new group. We also need to keep track of sample size. So this is a good example of kind of some rules of thumb. And we've talked about the rules of thumb with multiple regression and statistics. We've set a bare minimum of 10 per predictor, probably closer to 20. If we actually look at validation studies in IO psychology, these are more precise numbers. So basically looking across a meta-analysis of multiple validation studies, 2 predictors, you usually needed an N of at least 40 to have reliable results. 6 predictors instead of 120 or 60, 105. 10 predictors instead of 200, 194. But you can kind of see that when we actually ran the specific numbers, that 20 per variable was pretty close to what we found across multiple predictors. So I think that's probably a good rule of thumb to remember as you move forward as practitioners. 20 per variable is probably what you need, and that includes predictors. So the main thing that we're looking at when we're going through decision making in an organization is the elephant in the room, if you will, is that we are biased. Every single one of us is a combination of experiences, stimuli and response, and we have biases. We can't help it. It's how the human brain works. We categorize things. We can work to minimize biases. If you're cognitively engaged, if you're actually recognizing your biases and trying to be unbiased, it's very possible, but it requires effort. Now, some people are much more biased than others, but all of us carry some of these experiences, and sometimes we don't even recognize what they are. A fairly famous study when we first started looking at implicit data or implicit association tasks was the original researchers actually were looking at just basically bias against African Americans, basically looking at studies that associated mentally, cognitively, almost at an unconscious level, at a snap decision level, negative terms with African Americans and positive terms with European Americans. And they found this effect in everyone, anyone within the United States. Poor people, rich people, black people, white people, people that really didn't even have contact, because we're deluged with these images, media, representations. even if you are fighting and are very focused on the plight of minorities in the United States of America, that also means that you're associating that group with these plights. So we have to recognize that one of our goals is how do we reduce this bias by the situation and the tools we use. The more we can quantify the process to increase selection decision quality, generally speaking, the better response we get. So basically what we're looking at is two broad types of data. We're looking at data measurement and we're looking at the decision itself. Mechanical data measurement is basically objective measurement. It is count data. It's things that really can't be at least directly impacted by personal decisions or judgment or biases. Obviously, we've already talked about the more that we can use this for our selection decision making, the better, because by its very nature, it is going to be less biased by individual human judgments and decisions. However, not everything can be measured mechanically. So we also will probably want to collect some judgmental information as well. Personality, or basically interviews, job observations, things like that. So these judgmental ones, again though, if we can quantify them, if we can create a bar scale, if we can create even just a Likert-like scale, making people actually put numbers to their judgment, the reason this actually reduces bias is that it starts to make the person cognitively engage. If I'm allowed to just think about whether I like someone or not, I'm not really inspired to actually have to cognitively engage, which means my biases are more likely to be present. However, after interviewing someone, if I now have to assign a rating to them, we have a tendency to start to think about the person objectively, at least a little bit more, and we tend to find that these judgments are therefore less biased. And there's an enormous amount of research that has shown this. So the data measurement is pretty easy to sell in organizations. The next part's a little bit different. How do we actually make the decision once all the data is gathered? So we have in front of us all the data on multiple people that we're deciding on who to hire or who to promote or who to train. How is that decision being made? Is that decision being made purely by those ratings and the numbers, or are we making a judgmental decision? Is a person allowed to make that choice? And is that person allowed to ignore the numbers if they wish to? If so, we're reintroducing bias. So when it comes to decision making, we have two big models. We have the clinical composition strategy or clinical composite strategy, which is the most common, and we have the mechanical composite strategy. Now notice that there are other possibilities, but I'm not really talking about those because the first one is the same in both cases. We have both objective and subjective data. We've measured our candidates objectively and subjectively. We've looked at subjective and mechanical measurements of whether or not we're predicting them to do well at the job. We have numbers in front of us. We have information in front of us. The second part is what defines whether these strategies are different than not, and that is whether that decision is made subjectively. In other words, at the end of the day, it is the hiring manager, the boss, the owner that can ignore that data and make the decision based on their gut, their bias, their beliefs. Or do we allow the machines to do the work for us? Do we allow them to decide mechanically? In other words, we remove the human decision making at the end of the process. Whoever has the best numbers, assuming those numbers were collected by as the best rigorous methods we could, we let those numbers do the decision making for us. We do not allow human subjective opinions into the final process. Now I want to focus on the mechanical composite strategy for a moment and really stress that the human decision making is not removed from this model. It is simply removed from the end of this model. We still have the hiring managers, the interviewers, even the owner rating the subjects on some form of subjective scale. It is simply that we're now letting that rating stand. We're not letting them go back and second guess it. We're not letting them go, well, I didn't think this person was good, but now that I've thought about it a little bit more, I think it's better. Well, that thinking about it more probably was not highly engaged cognitively thinking. That's probably back of the brain, kind of going with the gut feeling. And what's wrong with going with the gut? Well, let's let some scientific research take a look at that question. So mechanical versus judgment in final decision making. Basically, there is no question. This is one of those things where we have seen meta-analysis after meta-analysis after meta-analysis, and every about 10 or 15 years, another large one comes out. Across the research, we have a unifying, solid answer to this question. Mechanical decisions are better than subjective judgment, almost every single time. Now, let me talk about what that means, because this is another area where we're going to fight and probably lose against the decision makers, because the decision makers don't want to give up their control. I am not saying that using just the numbers, a mechanical decision will always get you a better decision. In fact, that's one of the reasons that judgment is still around, is that almost every decision maker can point to the time where the numbers all said one thing, they went in the other direction, and guess what? They got lucky. This was the best hire ever. This was the best investment ever. This was the best decision ever. What that person is missing, though, is all of the times that they failed. If you talk to someone that regularly gambles and ask them how well they do, they're not going to tell you the story of the time they went to Las Vegas with $10,000 and left with zero. They're not going to tell you the time they went to the riverboat with $1,000 and 10 minutes later were out of money. They're going to tell you about the time they put $1 in a machine and got $600 back. They're going to tell you about the time that they were playing 5-card stud and they had the perfect hand and they did the perfect bluff and they won the entire pot. That's the stories they're going to tell. We, by our nature, like to feel good about ourselves, and we like to focus on our successes. What these studies looked at was overall success across multiple decisions. In other words, yes, individual judgment will sometimes find a diamond in the rough that the numbers would not have suggested as a diamond. However, for every one of those diamonds, you're getting a lot of pieces of coal. If you go to mechanical judgment, you might miss that diamond, but every single person that you hire is much more likely to at least be valuable. You're not getting diamonds and coal, you're getting a bunch of iron ore. I'm using a lot of weird analogies today, but that's honestly what we're looking at. And again, a mechanical process generally will find the diamond. If it's truly a diamond, its numbers are probably good as well. So Meehl in 1954 is the first person that looked at this, and this was more of a behavioral study. He examined 20 studies and found, again, strong evidence that if you actually just use the numbers, it almost always outperformed, on average, individual judgment making. Sawyer in 1966 looked at basically, and this was historically, there was about a 10-year period where the psychological sciences were picking on clinicians. And what they were looking at here was actual clinical psychologists, experts, making determinations about patients based on bias, judgment, their gut, and what the statistical prediction of the tools that they had available were. They looked at 45 different studies and again found strong evidence that the statistical prediction, the mechanical prediction, on average was always more accurate at actually predicting clinical diagnoses than the experts were. Grove et al. Looked at a meta-analysis in the year 2000, and this one actually was looking at organizations, 136 studies, and once again found this. It is almost unquestionable that if you can remove human decisions from the end of the process, overall across hiring, and we're not talking hiring one person, we're talking about hiring 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, 40 people a year, you're going to get better results. You're going to get people that do better in the job. On average, you're going to get people that stay with the job longer, have better performance across the board. The studies, there is no question, there is no alternate findings in these studies. Every meta-analysis has looked at this. Now you can find individual studies that look at one particular person that was really good at judgment. The problem is that that's not who you're going to have hiring. And if you do have that person hiring, they're probably not going to be the only person hiring. So again, if we really wanted to look at this from a bottom line value of just what makes most sense and what will make most money, return on investment for a company, it is removing humans from the final decision process in pretty much any decision. Have them involved in the subjective judgments and quantifying those judgments through the process, but at the end, once you have all the numbers, let the numbers speak. Now, like I said, that is the 100-yard line. That is the final point that we'd like to get that ball. It is going to be very hard, and honestly, I can tell you, I'm not really aware of any organization that does true mechanical decision making. Even here in this program, where I have loudly argued for this many, many times, at the end of the day, when we're making selections of students to come into our program, so basically who gets into the master's program, we have a lot of numbers in front of us, but the final decision is the 4 faculty members sitting down and discussing students. And a lot of times, the people we choose are the people the numbers would suggest, but sometimes there's an argument. And that argument is based on gut, based on judgment, based on feelings. And it happens. So even with people that know this, it is hard to get away from wanting to give up that final control element. So we're probably not going to get rid of judgments being made, a clinical model, if you will, in making decisions in organizations. But the more we can move towards getting away from it, the better. And I'm just really fond of this study because this kind of further illustrates that it's not just decision making in organizations or clinical decision making, it's almost any decision making. That broadly speaking, you can simply use numbers to outperform experts on average every single time. Now, again, I really want to stress that word on average. Yes, there are individual stockbrokers that make billions for their clients. They're very, very good at what they do, but they're very rare. And honestly, probably some of it is just blind luck occasionally. So Otterman, Geigerziner, Borges, and Goldstein in 2008 did what I thought was a fairly brilliant study. They basically asked 2 separate groups of people to pick stocks. The first group was experts. Highly paid stockbrokers were asked at the start of the year, put together a stock portfolio that is going to make money at the end of the year based on all of your skills and knowledge. And all of them put together profiles that they were very confident would make an enormous amount of money. The second group was they stopped people on the street and asked them to pick 5 stocks. Not experts, not even people that invest. Random people on the street. Now, the companies those random people chose were companies they recognized. In other words, they were companies that had name recognition, which generally are fairly stable, relatively successful companies. They chose 20th Century Fox, Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, Walmart, CBS. They chose those big names. And what we found was at the end of the year, guess what? Those people on the street, their imaginary portfolios on average outperformed the experts' portfolios that included lots of companies no one had ever heard of. Because those experts are desperately trying to find that hidden piece of gold that'll make an enormous amount of money. Now, what this represents, though, is that, again, a pool of experts were outperformed by a pool of people with absolutely no knowledge of how the stock market worked because we pooled the knowledge. We used mechanical decision making. So honestly, the people on the street was an example of collecting basically subjective data, but then letting that data make us an average. And that average was then used for the decision, and they weren't allowed to make decision changes afterwards. They weren't allowed to relook at the list and go, well, that's not what I wanted. We simply just used the ratings they gave companies based on name recognition alone, and they outperformed the experts over a year in the stock market. So my final message, if possible, we want to make sure that we're using both objective and subjective measures to gather the data. And we want to move as close as we can to objective decision making, mechanical decision making at the end, if we can move it in that direction. So the results, collect data objectively, collect data subjectively, but make final decisions on mechanically combined data whenever possible. So good luck. Like I said, we don't do it here. I don't know of any organization that truly does this. I know some that come close, and those ones actually do perform better. Overall, they've had better success, but even then, there's still a veto kind of switch in there where the CEO can occasionally come in and go, no, I don't want that person, I want this person. And it's easy for us to actually make arguments. The argument we make within the program here is that we're also trying to get at that kind of hard to quantify, how do we get together a cohort of 10 people that not only will do well in the program, but will hopefully get along well. And there really isn't a good measure for that, and that's how we kind of justify in our own head why we still want this judgmental, subjective quality in the final decision making. Data would argue that we shouldn't do that, but it's what we do. And sometimes we feel like we're successful, and when we are successful, we over-attend to it like all humans. And when we're non-successful, we tend to write it off as an aberration. So again, everyone self-dilutes. It's a part of being human. Just recognize that we're fighting a pretty major and deep part of what it means to be human when we're trying to argue against subjective decision making.